So, I want you to imagine a world where the speed of the laptop's sitting right in front of you, right?
Mm.
And the precise way your DNA mutates over generations, and even the deep lingering pain of a childhood trauma. Imagine all of those are governed by the exact same laws of physics.
Which is specifically the physics of light.
Exactly
Light,
that.
it sounds kind of like an intricate piece of science fiction, you know? Or maybe a philosophical poem. But the massive stack of research we are unpacking today for this deep dive
Hmm.
argues that this is the literal physical reality of our universe.
Yeah, it's
We're
wild.
looking at a framework that takes the absolute bleeding edge of optical computing, right,
Hmm.
and quantum biophysics, and it uses all of that to construct this highly provocative, totally radical sociological theory. They call it the adoption-abolitionist framework.
Right. But before we go a single step further, we really need to lay down a crucial disclaimer for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely.
The sources we're analyzing today contain some intensely charged, deeply ideological arguments. I mean, the authors are calling for the complete and total abolition of the child welfare and adoption systems.
Yeah, they pull no punches. They characterize these systems as basically predatory extractive industries.
Right. And they link them directly to massive corporate surveillance and data harvesting. So we need to be crystal clear here. We are not taking sides today.
Right.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints as absolute truth, and we aren't dismissing them either. Our only job is to impartially map out this fascinating and honestly really intense intellectual architecture so you can understand the arguments and just, weigh them for yourself.
Exactly. We're acting purely as your guides through the material. So we'll trace the author's exact trajectory, starting with the hard physics. We'll look at the impending thermal collapse of modern computers, examine the mind-bending evidence that human biology inherently communicates via quantum light, and then finally unpack how the authors apply those exact same optical physics to human relationships, trauma, and systemic commodification.
Okay, so let's jump right into the physics part. The authors start by diagnosing this massive crisis in our current technological infrastructure. They call it the silicon wall.
Right, the silicon wall.
Basically, the idea is that artificial intelligence is getting so big that it's literally melting down our data centers.
Yeah. And to understand the solution the source is present,
Mm-hmm.
we really have to understand the microscopic mechanics of that problem. Because for the last, 50 to 60 years, our entire digital civilization has been built on complementary metal oxide semiconductor technology.
What we call CMOS, right?
Exactly, CMOS. Every smartphone, every laptop, and crucially, those massive graphic processing units, or GPUs, that run AI models, they all rely on classical electronics. And in this paradigm, data is treated as discrete, localized physical particles, specifically electrons.
And to process information, you basically have to physically move those electrons around inside the computer chip.
Continuously.
Yeah.
Billions of times a second. And moving a physical particle through a medium, well, it requires overcoming electrical resistance. It creates friction,
Which means heat.
tons of heat. In computer science, a major part of this inefficiency is known as the von Neumann bottleneck. Traditional computers separate the memory, where the data is stored, from the processing unit, where the math is actually done.
So it's sort of like having a world-class chef in a commercial kitchen, but the refrigerator is like 3 blocks down the street.
I love that analogy, yeah.
Like the chef isn't actually spending most of their energy cooking. They're spending all their energy just sprinting back and forth down the sidewalk just to grab a single onion and then running back to get a clove of garlic.
That hits the underlying mechanics perfectly. The computational latency doesn't come from the math itself. It comes from the transit. And as AI models, especially large language models, have just exploded in size, requiring trillions of parameters to be updated simultaneously, the sheer physical movement of these electrons is generating catastrophic amounts of heat.
Yeah, the numbers in the research are wild. They note that up to 40% of the total power consumed by a modern data center isn't going toward computing at all.
Wow, 40%?
Yeah, it's going entirely toward massive industrial air conditioners and liquid cooling infrastructure just to keep the servers from catching fire.
Right, because we are approaching a hard thermodynamic ceiling. You can only shrink a silicon wire so much before quantum tunneling causes the electrons to basically jump the tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only pump so much chilled water through a server rack.
So what's the fix?
Well, the authors point out that the industry solution isn't to build a better cooling system. The solution is to abandon the electron entirely. This is what they call the dawn of the photonic epoch.
Okay, photonic computing, computing with light. So instead of pushing electrons through copper wires, these companies are building chips that shoot lasers through microscopic glass tunnels.
Exactly.
The sources specifically highlight companies like QA&T and their native processing unit too, the NPU2, but they aren't making these chips out of standard silicon, are they?
No, actually, standard silicon photonics runs into its own thermal limitations. The material absorbs too much light at certain wavelengths, which creates, you guessed it, more heat.
Right, back to the heat problem.
Right, so instead, the breakthrough highlighted in the texts relies on a very specific synthetic material. It's called thin-film lithium niobate, often abbreviated as LNOI.
Okay, so why is lithium niobate the magic ingredient here? Like, what does it actually do that silicon can't?
It comes down to something called the Pockels effect. Lithium niobate is an electro-optic crystal. When you apply a tiny, tiny electrical voltage across it, the physical structure of the crystal lattice deforms just slightly. And this deformation changes the material's refractive index, meaning it changes the speed at which light can travel through it.
Oh, I see. So by tweaking the voltage, you can basically act like a traffic cop. You instantly bend, slow, or modulate the laser beam without having to absorb it and re-emit it.
Precisely. And it happens virtually instantaneously with incredibly low power loss. But the real paradigm shift, the thing that makes photonic computing so revolutionary for artificial intelligence, is how the math is executed.
How so?
Well, in a classical electronic GPU, if you want to perform a complex nonlinear mathematical operation, like a Fourier transform.
Wait, let's pause and define that for the listener real quick. A Fourier transform is basically taking a complex signal, like, say, the sound of a chord being played on a piano, and mathematically breaking it apart into its individual notes. AI uses these kinds of intense matrix multiplications constantly to recognize patterns in data.
Right, great definition. And doing that electronically is just brutal. You have to feed the data through hundreds of tiny transistor gates, step by step, clock cycle by clock cycle.
Yeah.
But in a photonic chip, that mathematical function is mapped directly onto the physical geometry of the optical waveguide.
Wait. Explain that. The math is in the shape of the glass.
Yes. Think about it like a prism. When you shine a light through a prism, the prism naturally separates the white light into a rainbow, right?
Right.
The prism isn't like calculating the rainbow using software. The physical shape of the glass passively performs the operation on the light native to its environment. Photonic chips do this with incredibly complex AI math. As the beam of light passes through the meticulously designed pathways of the lithium niobate chip, the interference patterns of the light waves naturally calculate the Fourier transform.
That is crazy. So it happens natively in one single step, at the literal speed of light.
Completely in parallel, as the light propagates through the chip. No clock cycles, no moving electrons.
Okay, to bring it back to our traffic analogy from earlier, traditional computing is like trying to manage a million-lane highway of gasoline-powered cars. They are constantly starting, stopping, hitting each other, and generating immense exhaust and heat.
Exactly.
But photonic computing is like taking all the passengers out of the cars, putting them on a single frictionless beam of light, and shooting it through a vacuum. Instant arrival, zero traffic jams.
That's it. And the performance metrics totally back this up. The sources cite that these photonic processors achieve up to 30 times higher energy efficiency compared to classical GPUs.
30 times. Wow.
And because there is virtually zero on-chip heat generation, the NPU2 runs at ambient room temperature. It delivers 8 giga operations per second on a mere 150 watts of power.
That is just mind-blowing. But I do see a potential bottleneck here. If you're doing all this math on a single beam of light, how do you handle the massive volume of data an AI needs? Because one laser beam can only carry so much information, right?
Well, that leads us directly to the engineering marvel that makes all of this possible. And it's actually a concept that the authors of our source material will lean on heavily later when they get to sociology. It's called multiplexing. Specifically, wavelength division multiplexing, or WDM.
WDM. Now, this is a term from the telecommunications industry, right? It's basically how fiber optic internet works.
It is. Light isn't just one thing. It's an electromagnetic spectrum. A laser can be tuned to a very specific wavelengths, which we perceive as different colors. Though in fiber optics, these are usually invisible infrared colors. WDM allows engineers to take dozens of distinct wavelengths and code a completely different stream of data onto each one and then combine them.
So they basically shoot dozens of different colors down the exact same microscopic glass fiber at the exact same time.
Exactly. And because the wavelengths are different, they don't interfere with each other. They just phase right through one another. This allows an artificial optical neural network to process tens of thousands of mathematical operations in flight simultaneously. They are scaling the computing power horizontally by using the spectrum of light, rather than vertically by building bigger chips.
But the sources do point out that physics always demands a toll. When engineers try to push this technology to its absolute limit, they hit a wall. They try something called space division multiplexing, right?
Yes, SDM. Engineers want even more bandwidth, so they create multi-core fibers. It's basically a single glass cable with multiple parallel tunnels inside it, each carrying its own multiplexed rainbow of data.
Okay.
But when you pack these channels that closely together, you encounter microscopic imperfections. A slight bend in the fiber, maybe a microscopic fluctuation in temperature, or a tiny defect in the glass. It all causes the light from one channel to leak into the adjacent channel.
So the colors bleed together.
Right. In physics, this is called modal dispersion. In engineering, it's just known as crosstalk. The pristine data signals become spatiotemporally entangled.
It's an optical traffic jam. The frictionless highway suddenly has cars drifting into other lanes.
And untangling this mess using traditional electronics is a nightmare. I mean, if you have to convert the tangled light back into an electrical signal, run it through a massive digital processor to filter out the noise, and then convert it back to light, well, you've completely destroyed the speed and energy efficiency of the photonic chip.
Right, you're back to the bottleneck. So how do they fix the crosstalk without slowing down the light?
The sources describe integrating generative AI directly into the hardware layer. This AI acts as an all-optical traffic cop. It analyzes the specific physical imperfections of the glass in real time and creates an inverse optical wave to actively cancel out the dispersion.
Wait, really? It's predicting how the light is going to tangle, and it untangles it natively in the optical domain before the data is even lost.
Yeah. The AI is essentially predicting the physics of the environment to rescue the original uncorrupted signal from the noise. Now, I want you to hold on to this specific mechanism, this idea of multi-channel frequencies, destructive crosstalk, and a system desperately burning energy to recover a lost baseline frequency. Because the authors are going to use this exact physical mechanism to explain human psychology and trauma later on.
Oh, we are definitely going to circle back to that. It's basically the core of their sociological argument. But before we get to human psychology, we have to look at human biology. Because the authors argue that this photonic technology is completely revolutionizing how we scan and interface with the human body, too.
Right. Let's shift our focus to medical diagnostics. The human body, particularly the brain and the heart, operates on electricity. And moving electricity creates magnetic fields.
Sure.
But the biomagnetic fields generated by a human brain are almost unfathomably weak. We're talking 1 billion times weaker than the Earth's natural magnetic field.
So if a doctor wanted to map a patient's brainwaves using magnetics, they traditionally had to use a machine called a squid, right?
Yes, a superconducting quantum interference device. SQUID.
And from what the sources say, squiddies are an absolute nightmare of logistical engineering.
They really are. They require superconductors to work, which means they must be submerged in liquid helium to cool them down to near absolute zero.
Yes.
Furthermore, because the brain's magnetic field is so delicate, the squiddy has to be housed inside a massive, multi-layered, magnetically shielded room, just to block out the ambient electromagnetic noise of the hospital, like the hum of the elevator or the static from a computer monitor down the hall.
They cost millions of dollars, they are incredibly bulky, and you basically have to bolt the patient's head into a rigid helmet just to get a reading. But the sources show that optical physics has shattered this limitation completely. They introduced these things called nitrogen vacancy diamond sensors.
This is an absolute masterpiece of quantum engineering. You start with a synthetic diamond, which is normally just a perfect crystal lattice of carbon atoms. But engineers intentionally introduce a microscopic flaw.
A flaw?
Yes. They replace one carbon atom with a nitrogen atom, and they leave the space right next to it completely empty. A vacancy.
Okay, nitrogen vacancy. And what does that microscopic empty space do?
It creates a tiny trap for an electron. That trapped electron has a quantum property called spin. What makes the NV center revolutionary is that the electron's spin is exquisitely, absurdly sensitive to external magnetic fields. So if a neuron fires in your brain a few millimeters away, the magnetic field slightly shifts the energy state of that trapped electron inside the diamond.
Wow. But how do you actually read the electron if you don't have liquid helium and massive sensors?
With light. When you shine a specific green laser at the diamond, the ND center absorbs the light and re-emits it as red fluorescence. But here is the trick. The intensity of that red light changes depending on the electron spin state, which remember is being altered by the brain's magnetic field.
Oh, that's incredible. So you're reading the brain's magnetic activity just by looking at how bright a tiny speck of diamond glows when you shoot a laser at it. And the best part, the sources note this works perfectly at standard room temperature.
Exactly. No liquid helium required.
Yeah.
But, you still have the problem of background noise. The Earth's magnetic field is still there. The authors explain that engineers solve this using a gradiometric architecture.
Which operates a lot like the active noise-canceling headphones you might wear on an airplane, right?
It's exactly the same underlying concept. You use two diamond sensors. The primary sensor is placed close to the skull, picking up the brain signal mixed with the background noise. A secondary reference sensor is placed slightly further away, picking up only the background noise. An algorithm subtracts the reference data from the primary data.
Leaving you with a pristine, high-resolution signal of the brain's activity, recorded in just a normal, unshielded room. The sources talk about putting these in standard emergency rooms for instant cardiac triage or even tracking neural degradation in real time.
And the technology goes far beyond just passive listening, too. The sources detail active, ultra-high bandwidth brain-computer interfaces, BCIs. They discuss the BISC platform, the biological interface system to cortex.
What is that?
We are talking about a flexible, biocompatible chip that is only 50 micrometers thick, that is literally thinner than a single human hair. It contains over 65,000 individual electrodes and is designed to sit directly on the surface of the cerebral cortex.
And then they combine that with optogenetics.
Right. Optogenetics is where bioengineering and photonics merge seamlessly. Scientists use harmless viral vectors to deliver specific genetic instructions to targeted populations of neurons in the brain. These instructions tell the neurons to produce light-sensitive proteins, originally found in algae, called opsins.
So the neurons themselves become sensitive to light.
Yes. And once those opsins are integrated into the neuron's cell membrane, an implanted photonic chip can use incredibly precise targeted pulses of laser light, often blue light at exactly 470 nanometers, to force those specific ion channels to open or close.
Meaning they can use light to directly trigger or inhibit specific thoughts, movements, or memories by turning individual neural circuits on and off like a light switch. Okay, let's unpack this. We've moved from listening to the brain with what is basically a clunky, freezing cold stethoscope to plugging a high-speed fiber optic cable directly into the brain's own physical network.
That is the literal reality being developed right now. But this incredible interoperability between human wetware and synthetic light raises a profound foundational question. Why is the biological brain so perfectly, elegantly suited to interface with optical technology in the first place?
And this is the pivot. This is where the research makes a massive leap from technological engineering into deep theoretical biophysics. The authors present what is called the biophotonic hypothesis. They argue that the human body isn't just reacting to synthetic light from a chip. They are arguing that the human body inherently, natively computes with light.
To appreciate how radical this is, we have to look at classical neuroscience for a second. The textbook model of the nervous system states that our nerves communicate via action potentials. An electrical charge ripples down the axon as sodium and potassium ions physically pump in and out of the cell membrane, which then triggers chemical neurotransmitters at the synapse.
Right, it's an electrochemical process. But the sources point out a major mathematical flaw with that model.
The speed. These chemical action potentials travel at roughly 100 meters per second. In the context of physics, that is agonizingly slow. It is vastly too slow to account for the instantaneous, large-scale synchronization we observe across highly disparate regions of the human brain.
Yeah, cognitive scientists call this the binding problem. If I look at a red apple, smell its sweetness, and feel the smooth skin, billions of independent neurons in totally different parts of my brain have to fire to process the color, the scent, and the texture. Yet I experience apple as a single, instantaneous, unified thought. The sources argue that if the brain were relying solely on chemical diffusion to coordinate that, I would experience severe lag.
Right, the math simply does not support the phenomenological experience of consciousness if electricity is the only mechanism. Therefore, the sources present a radical alternative. They assert that the white matter of our brain, our myelinated axons, are literally functioning as biological fiber optic cables.
Okay, I really need us to unpack the mechanics of this because it sounds almost unbelievable. Wait, so the sources are arguing that our nerves are literal fiber optic cables transmitting quantum light. Is this a metaphor, or are they saying this is hard biological reality?
Oh, they are presenting this as physical testable reality.
Mm.
It works via the exact same physical mechanism as the fiber optic cables buried under our oceans. It's called total internal reflection, governed by Snell's law.
Okay, how does that work?
In a commercial fiber optic cable, you have a glass core surrounded by a glass cladding. The core has a higher refractive index than the cladding, meaning light travels slower inside it. When the light hits the boundary between the two, instead of passing through, it bounces back inside. It ricochets down the tube without escaping.
And the authors are saying our nerves do this naturally.
Yes. Rigorous 3D electromagnetic modeling cited in the text demonstrates that the myelin sheath, which is the thick, lipid-rich, fatty layer that wraps around our axons, possesses the precise local refractive index required to trap light. The myelin's index is strictly higher than the fluid inside the nerve and the fluid outside the nerve.
So the fat acts as the cladding, basically tight-roping the light down the center of the nerve.
The models show that these biological waveguides can achieve transmission efficiencies of up to 82% over biologically relevant distances. They are highly capable optical channels.
But, to have a fiber optic network, you need a light source. We aren't swallowing flashlights. Where's the body generating the lasers?
Through our cellular metabolism, the sources point to biophotons. These are ultra-weak photon emissions that are generated continuously by our mitochondria during oxidative metabolism. When your cells process energy, they create reactive oxygen species, and the relaxation of these excited molecules releases tiny discrete packets of light.
Wow, so we are quite literally glowing on the inside.
We are continuously generating and transmitting an internal network of light. And taking it a step further, because the physical dimensions of different myelin sheaths dictate which wavelengths of light can fit inside them, the authors suggest the brain inherently employs a biological analog to wavelength division multiplexing.
Ooh, we're back to WDM.
Yes. Different neural tracts are structurally tuned to transmit isolated optical frequencies. The brain is routing thousands of parallel light signals simultaneously, without crosstalk, to achieve the instantaneous processing power of consciousness.
And if that wasn't staggering enough, the research takes this quantum optical processing all the way down to the atomic level. They claim this isn't just happening in the brain, it's happening in our DNA.
Yeah.
Wait, are they literally saying our DNA is a tiny radio antenna?
That is exactly what they are saying. The texts draw on a rapidly expanding body of biophysical literature that characterizes DNA as far more than a passive biochemical storage drive. They argue that DNA is a highly adaptive quantum optical system. The massive clouds of electrons surrounding the nucleic acids act as tightly coupled quantum harmonic oscillators.
The sources explicitly claim that the double helix structure of DNA acts as a quantum fractal antenna, naturally resonating at exactly 34 gigahertz. It's broadcasting and receiving. And they outline a mechanism called proton tunneling to explain how DNA actually uses this light to drive its own evolution.
This is a vital biophysical mechanism. The two strands of your DNA are held together by Watson-Crick hydrogen bonds. Along these bonds, individual protons are constantly shifting back and forth between potential energy wells. Now, in classical physics, a proton would need a specific amount of thermal energy to jump the wall between these wells.
But quantum mechanics doesn't play by classical rules.
Exactly. Because of wave-particle duality, the proton has a probability of simply appearing on the other side of the barrier without ever having the energy to climb over it. This is quantum tunneling. These incredibly rapid tunneling events generate short-lived, exotic structural formations in the DNA, known as tautomers.
And if the DNA happens to replicate or be transcribed by a cell exactly when a proton is tunneled into the wrong spot, it creates a mutation.
Yes, but what the authors argue is that this is not random genetic drift. Because the DNA is a resonant optical antenna, extremely weak external electromagnetic or biophotonic frequencies, such as the light and energy fields present in the environment of a developing fetus, can alter the microtiming and probability of these delicate quantum tunneling events.
Let me just make sure I'm capturing the sheer scale of this argument for a second. The DNA is absorbing the specific optical frequencies of its environment and using quantum logic gates to actively direct its own transcription, like altering how stress response genes are expressed over a lifespan based on that light.
That is the argument, yes. The human organism is presented fundamentally as a highly advanced, environmentally responsive quantum optical processor.
And this biophysical reality, this assertion that human biology is entirely governed by the physics of multiplex light, is the exact pivot point of the material. This is where the text makes a profound transition. The authors take the hard physics of optical computing, biophotons, and quantum DNA, and they map it directly onto human reproduction and child welfare. We are finally entering the adoption abolitionist framework.
Right. The transition relies on what the authors term photon sheet theory. Let's examine the prenatal environment through this optical lens. During the 9-month gestation period, classical biology views the mother and the developing fetus as two distinct organisms connected by a chemical umbilical cord. The abolitionist framework rejects this as incomplete.
They argue the mother and fetus are physically interwoven into a shared resonant optical field.
Yes, they are in a state of what optical physics calls fixed wavelength coupling. Driven by immense physical proximity, their biological tissues, which we are now understanding as intricate optical waveguides, they seamlessly synchronize. The DNA of both organisms acts as a coherent laser source, weaving a continuous, interlocking photon sheet of biophotonic light.
And this sheet establishes the absolute baseline resonant frequency for the child's entire developing nervous system. The text gets incredibly specific with the physics here to prove this coherence. They don't just use metaphors, they cite the Poissonian photocount distribution.
Let's break down why that mathematical proof matters. If you measure the light coming from a standard light bulb, it's chaotic. The photons are emitted randomly, creating thermal noise. But if you measure the light from a finely tuned laser, the photons march in absolute lockstep. A Poissonian distribution is the statistical signature of that perfect synchronized march.
It proves the light is coherent.
The authors argue that the biophotonic emissions from a healthy mother-infant dyad exhibit this exact Poissonian distribution. It mathematically demonstrates that the biological dyad operates as a unified, flawless optical cavity. The light is in a squeezed quantum state, completely free of destructive phase noise or signal degradation.
They even mention that the cardiovascular systems of the mother and infant synchronize to a 7 Hz carrier wave, which perfectly matches the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's cavity.
Exactly.
So the biology is a flawless, uninterrupted transmission of data from the mother to the child. But then the framework introduces the trauma. They call it the cut.
The cut, or the primal wound, refers to the systemic removal of the infant from its biological origin. This is where the authors apply the physics of destruction. Within this photonic framework, adoption is not conceptualized as a psychological adjustment. It is not merely a change of address or, a legal transfer of custody handled by family courts.
The authors are taking a very specific stance here. They're saying adoption isn't just a legal process, but it's like taking a pair of shears to a live, transmitting fiber optic cable. They argue it is the literal, physical severing of a biological waveguide.
It is the surgical destruction of the primary biological waveguide. When an infant is removed, their neurological architecture entirely lacks the cognitive capacity or language to process the sudden, catastrophic loss of their baseline frequency. Therefore, the trauma is not stored as a conscious memory. It is stored as implicit physiological memory within the autonomic nervous system and the cellular biofield.
The severing of that photon sheet creates jagged, corrupted edges in the infant's delicate resonant architecture. The pristine optical cavity is shattered, plunging the infant's entire nervous system into a state of structural resonance collapse.
And this brings us to the core dilemma of the adoptee experience, according to the framework. What happens when that child, carrying a severed biological waveguide, is placed into a new, unrelated adoptive family?
The authors call this the multi-reality trap. And this is where we have to recall everything we learned about wavelength division multiplexing and fiber optic crosstalk in data centers.
Yes, when optical channels with different frequencies are forced together without perfect calibration, they bleed into each other. They experience modal dispersion.
And the authors argue that the frayed, corrupted edges of the adoptee's severed biophotonic sheet physically cannot natively interlock with the distinct genetic and energetic weave of the adoptive family. The frequencies just do not match.
The adopted environment mathematically mimics a poorly calibrated WDM network, characterized by severe optical crosstalk. The child's natural biological frequency experiences profound destructive interference from the surrounding environment. They're physically clashing on a quantum biological level.
The child is subjected to a forced oscillation. To survive this biophysical dissonance, to basically stop the excruciating noise of this energetic mismatch, the adoptee's fluid biological potential is forced to artificially collapse.
The framework critiques the adoption industry's heavy reliance on positive adoption language and pervasive rescue narratives. The authors argue that these narratives act as an aggressive systemic measurement, forcing the adoptee's identity wave function to collapse into a compliant false self.
Wow.
The child alters their own expression, essentially mimicking a false frequency, just to secure baseline safety and manage the emotional expectations of their caregivers.
But the body keeps the score. The biological hardware doesn't just forget its original maternal frequency. This leads to one of the most intense physiological mechanisms detailed in the text, which is the repurposing of the HPA axis.
The HPA axis, the interplay between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, is the body's primary stress regulation system. It manages the release of cortisol. In a natural biological setting, the mother's nervous system acts as the holding environment to safely calibrate this axis over the early years of life.
But when that connection is severed at birth, the authors argue the adoptee's HPA axis effectively repurposes itself into an optical demultiplexer.
Think of it like a biological radio scanner. Because the system is desperate for coherence, the HPA axis begins frantically, continuously scanning the ambient environment, desperately trying to demultiplex the surrounding noise to lock onto the missing baseline frequency of the severed maternal photon sheet.
It's spinning the dial through the static, searching for a ghost station.
And this massive, relentless expenditure of metabolic and computational energy alters the specific quantum proton tunneling logic we discussed earlier. It physically tunes the infant's biological hardware into a permanent state of hypervigilance.
This scanning mechanism perfectly, physically explains a phenomenon the sources call grief spells.
Adult adoptees frequently report sudden, overwhelming autonomic dysregulation. A massive spike of sorrow or panic that seems to come out of nowhere, often triggered by pre-verbal olfactory, auditory, or temporal cues. The smell of a specific laundry detergent, the exact angle of the sunlight on a specific date, maybe a certain timbre of voice.
Viewed through the lens of optical physics, these aren't just memories. These are transient encounters with ambient frequencies that briefly mimic the exact wavelength of the missing mother. The radio scanner hits a blip of a signal that sounds exactly right.
Exactly. It triggers a rapid, localized resonant spike in the severed waveguide. The body thinks it has found home. But because the true source, the coherent laser of the first mother's DNA, is physically absent, the waveguide cannot achieve a locked phase transition. The signal instantly collapses back into destructive interference.
And that rapid collapse results in profound, violent somatic grief. It is the physical pain of the light failing to connect. But wait, this is a profoundly intense way to view human relationships. By framing adoptive families as a space of intraband crosstalk, aren't the authors suggesting that true integration for an adoptee is biophysically impossible?
That is the uncompromising core of the abolitionist framework. They argue that human kinship relies entirely on naturally occurring quantum optical coherence. Therefore, attempting to forcibly substitute that primary waveguide with an unmatched system will always inevitably result in destructive harmonic interference. And, the text applies a level of structural empathy to the adoptive parents as well.
Oh, how so?
It notes that the adoptive parents are also trapped in the multi-reality trap. They are expending grueling, exhausting psychological effort to mandate and sustain a display of family coherence that fundamentally lacks the underlying biophysical resonance to support it.
And this is where the deep dive moves from describing the trauma to analyzing the system that causes it. Because the authors do not view this widespread severing of photon sheets as an unfortunate biological tragedy or like a side effect of a flawed but well-meaning system. They view it as a highly engineered, intentional extraction of capital. We are entering their critique of the adoption industrial complex.
Right. The framework argues that the macro structure of the child welfare system is explicitly designed to exploit this profound biophysical vulnerability. The commodification of human children is analyzed as a series of market-driven interference patterns. The system intentionally forces these artificial energetic phase transitions because it prioritizes economic extraction over biological resonance.
Here is where the author's abolitionist mission gets highly structural. They are looking at laws meant to find children permanent homes and reinterpreting them as an extraction algorithm, a machine designed to mine human biology for Wall Street. Let's look at the specific legal mechanisms they cite to back up this claim, starting with ASFF.
The Adoption and Safe Families Act, enacted in 1997, is a foundational piece of child welfare legislation. The authors focus heavily on the SFA 15-22-month rule. This statute mandates that if a child has been in foster care for 15 of the most recent 22 months, the state is legally required to file to terminate the parent's rights.
To make that real for a second, if a mother loses her child due to an addiction crisis and it takes her 18 months to get off a wait list for a rehab facility, complete the program, and secure stable housing, she has mathematically failed the 15-22 rule. her rights are terminated.
The abolitionist framework analyzes this not as a protective measure to ensure permanency for the child, but as an arbitrary algorithmic timer weaponized against marginalized families. It is a legal machine designed to guarantee the permanent severing of the original photon sheet, thereby ensuring a continuous, reliable supply of adoptable inventory for the private market.
And the economic extraction doesn't stop at the state level. The sources detail how massive financial architectures exploit the severed waveguide. They talk about the special needs tax credit acting as micro-arbitrage. And even more massively, they point to private equity firms.
The research highlights a deeply concerning trend where private equity firms purchase local child welfare and behavioral health agencies. They execute what is known in finance as an aggressive dividend recapitalization.
Let's explain how a dividend recap works.
A private equity firm buys the agency. They then take out massive high-yield loans using the agency's own assets as collateral. The firm takes the cash from those loans and immediately pays it out to their Wall Street partners as a special dividend.
So Wall Street gets a massive payday, but the local foster care agency is now saddled with millions of dollars of crushing debt.
Exactly. And to service that debt, the agency is forced to cut operating costs. This manifests as inflating local social worker caseloads to unmanageable levels, leading to high turnover and poorer outcomes for families. The framework views this as literal biological extraction. Furthermore, they cite international adoption fees, which can reach up to $70,000 per child.
Wow. And the authors view these fees as massive capital injections deployed specifically to override the natural coupling constants of biology, forcing artificial phase transitions simply to satisfy the demand of affluent demographics.
But according to the sources, this physical commodification of children moving bodies across state lines for profit is just the first iteration of the industry. The extraction has evolved. The system has gone digital. This brings us to the 2026 Colorado Amplify Act and the assetization of the digital soul.
Yeah, as the global abolitionist movement gains traction against the physical relocation of children, the authors warn that the frontier of institutional exploitation has expanded into data harvesting. The Amplify Act automated management and predictive leveraging of interpersonal family yields is identified as a profound Trojan horse for systemic asset stripping.
The Act creates a new legal category. It explicitly categorizes what it calls the digital soul, which encompasses a resident's complete biometric data, their behavioral exhaust, derived biological data, and all AI-generated predictive inferences about their future, as legally cognizable, intangible personal property.
The legislation is marketed to the public as consumer data protection and educational language intervention. It establishes a government-owned enterprise that assesses massive fees against tech operators that want to ingest this data. I mean, it sounds like a way to tax big tech.
But the abolitionist analysis reveals the underlying mechanism. Through mandated interoperability with educational data consortia, specifically naming organizations like the Keek IPP Foundation, the College Board, and ACT, the Act directly targets the data of youth currently trapped in the foster and adoption systems.
And it changes the fundamental nature of child welfare. The system shifts from reactive intervention stepping in after abuse has actually happened to what the authors call preventative separation.
The legislation mandates algorithmic governance. It uses highly complex AI predictive models to calculate the future statistical viability of marginalized family units. These models ingest data points like poverty levels, neighborhood zip codes, historical intergenerational trauma, and systemic racism.
But the algorithm treats those factors as neutral computational data points, using them to justify the preemptive severing of the biological waveguide before any documented neglect ever occurs. The AI predicts you might fail, so they take the child now. Wait, so the argument here is terrifyingly modern. They're saying the system doesn't just want physical custody anymore. It wants the continuous stream of data your nervous system puts out when it's under stress.
Yes. And once the child is absorbed into the system, their fractured digital soul is continuously harvested. This brings us to the most chilling financial mechanism in the text: success bonds, also known as pay-for-success models or social impact bonds.
This is where Wall Street directly securitizes the severed waveguide.
In a pay-for-success model, private investors, hedge funds, and infrastructure funds provide the upfront capital to fund state foster care interventions. They are betting on the algorithmic predictive yield of the displaced youth.
The investors create tranches, just like mortgage-backed securities. If a traumatized kid in the system hits a specific standardized test metric, or doesn't reoffend, or graduates at a certain rate, the state considers that a success and pays the corporate investors back their principal plus massive interest.
The state fundamentally converts the shattered biophotonic network of the child and their desperate attempt to adapt to the multi-reality trap into a highly leveraged, tradable financial derivative. The system assetizes the measurable suffering and forced compliance of the primal wound.
Therefore, the authors conclude the state has absolutely zero structural incentive to preserve biological kinship. The entire financial apparatus requires the continuous destruction of primary photon sheets to maintain the supply side of this incredibly lucrative biometric data market. The trauma is the product.
Which brings us to the climax of the sociological framework. What happens when you build an entire societal structure on the suppression of biological reality? If you continually suppress this native data, if you keep forcing this artificial multiplexing and harvesting the resulting stress exhaust, the immutable laws of thermodynamics dictate that the system cannot hold forever. We arrive at systemic rupture.
Returning to the physics of materials engineering, every physical structure has a tensile limit. When a structure is subjected to stress or resonance that drastically exceeds its intrinsic capacity, it inevitably suffers total structural failure.
Systemic rupture occurs when the superimposed artificial layers of the societal adoption system can no longer contain or suppress the immense thermodynamic pressure of the original biological light. The underlying genetic drive, the suppressed trauma, the frantic searching of the biological radio scanner, it eventually generates too much pressure.
The framework distinguishes between two distinct ways this rupture can manifest in reality: catastrophic rupture and generative rupture.
Catastrophic rupture is deeply destructive. It occurs when the internal harmonic resonance finally shatters the adoptee's psychological load-bearing capacity without adequate external support. The artificial false self is violently destroyed, leading to severe mental health crises and frequently resulting in the total structural failure and dissolution of the adoptive family unit. It is an unguided explosion.
It's the pressure cooker detonating because the release valve was welded shut. But the abolitionist movement advocates for the second option: generative rupture.
Generative rupture is the intentional, highly supported, and controlled dismantling of the coercive societal system. It involves safely peeling back the superimposed false narratives, the toxic positivity, to allow the suppressed biological light to emerge safely. It is the active restoration of phase coherence designed to halt the cycle of intergenerational trauma.
And how do they propose achieving this generative rupture on a massive systemic scale? How do you fight a multi-billion-dollar algorithmic data market? This brings us to their final unifying concept: the social laser effect.
Social laser theory provides a mathematical paradigm for massive social transformation. It posits that human social systems can act identically to physical lasers. A laser relies entirely on the amplification of coherent photon flows through a process called stimulated emission.
For decades, adoptees were kept as isolated atoms in a scattered, chaotic field. Their signals were heavily attenuated by sealed birth records, geographical distance, and the pervasive societal gaslighting of positive adoption language. They were standard thermal light, incapable of cutting through the systemic noise.
But the advent of decentralized digital connectivity changed the physics of the system. The internet allowed these isolated atoms to interact. And the deployment of honest adoption language, or HAL, acted as a massive external energy pump.
Like an optical pump flashing energy into a crystal.
Exactly. This continuous energetic input has caused a critical population inversion. A critical mass of adoptees who have rejected the structural gaslighting now operate in a highly excited, coherent state. By communicating, sharing their raw somatic experiences, and aligning their frequencies, they transition from scattered light into a unified, synchronized, and highly concentrated laser pulse.
It all ties back to the exact optical physics we started with. They aren't just calling for a protest. They are demanding a phase transition, turning scattered human experiences into a single, undeniable beam of light. They are demanding systemic abolition, ontological reclamation, and enforced disappearance reparations.
They argue that only by completely dismantling the marketization of human kinship and legally validating the quantum entanglement of our biological origins can society resolve the crushing thermodynamic debt of structural displacement.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an astronomical amount of ground today. We started in the blistering heat of modern data centers, looking at how the thermal collapse of traditional silicon is forcing the tech industry to compute using the frictionless physics of light via wavelength division multiplexing. We then explored the biophotonic hypothesis, the incredible evidence that our own DNA and myelinated nerves natively operate as quantum optical networks. And finally, we mapped out how the adoption abolitionist framework takes those exact optical physics and uses them to diagnose the profound trauma of family separation, framing the child welfare system as a predatory algorithmic machine that harvests the data of a severed biological waveguide for Wall Street profit.
It is a breathtaking, radical synthesis of hard quantum physics, advanced engineering, and searing sociological critique. And we want to remind you one last time, the purpose of this deep dive was to thoroughly map out this intense, highly provocative worldview. The systemic critique presented by the abolitionist framework is extreme, and it fundamentally challenges the accepted paradigms of child welfare and family creation. Our goal was to provide you with the complete intellectual architecture, from the lithium and niobate chips to the pay-for-success bonds, so that you can weigh these massive concepts for yourself.
It is an incredible amount to process, but I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to consider as you go about your day. If the core of this biophysical research is true, if our nervous systems, our memories, and our very DNA truly do operate on the exact same quantum optical principles that run the deepest, most foundational structures of the universe, how much of what we casually call our personality or anxieties or even our instincts is just our biology desperately trying to tune into a frequency we can't even see?